Okay, folks. I'm just trying to. What I want to do here is to make sure. I want to make sure that we are, since we're missing today, and we have a big deliverable due the Monday after spring break, and I will be difficult to get a hold of, I think, between now and then. So I wanted to give you guys at least a brief summary of what I was going to talk about today. So we ended last day on the Kano model, and this takes some thinking to get through. We picked this apart a little bit. It's a really important, interesting idea. Um, may not. It's more so in traditional product development that it makes more sense. So not so much for you guys when you're working with a particular client. You're not working with a company trying to launch a product for mass delivery and consumption. However, still important things to know. Um, so this is where we ended last time on the Kano model, and then to continue on with requirements. Let me. Okay, so the next page here was about collecting customer data, and so now that you've done a lot of qualitative stuff with contextual inquiries, I hope many of you. I was quite pleased that most of the groups had a good understanding from the first report of what's generally going on, where are issues showing up, what processes do not exist, or there's a lot of default processes that need to be tightened up. So now you folks need to justify why are you focusing in on, say, the ordering process or something. You have to justify why that's more important than other problems. So that means you're going to have to collect some of your own data. The data they hand you, it wouldn't be enough typically to answer this question. So it doesn't have to be perfect data, but it does have to tell some kind of picture that, oh, there are some issues that are more important than others. So the book has a little bit, maybe some surveys and so on. And I wouldn't say, to be honest, I wouldn't say, since it's not an IE design textbook, this chapter isn't great. You basically have to depend on uh, data gathering techniques from uh, Dr. Van Berkel's course, Processes and Systems. So really, at this point, this is where kind of some IE work happens. We've done the soft stuff, if you will, of defining the problem. Now we're gathering data. We use traditional IE techniques to do that. So he taught you work sampling, um, process mapping, um, fishbone diagrams, etc. Okay, so you need to lean on that stuff now. Get back to that. See what's helpful. There's some stuff about surveys, etc. If you're going the marketing route, drumming up more business route, that might be more relevant. But definitely leaning on typical IE measurement tools from Processes and Systems course. That's important. This is a good overview of the types of customer requirements. So what kind of things should we look out for? Um, Let me delete this. It's not doing what I want it to do. Um, so, yeah. Anyhow, these are good. I'm not going to go through them. This is just a good to say which of these you folks have to use. The discernment in figuring out, well, which of these are appropriate for our particular context, okay? So, yeah, here's a list of things that maybe are kind of a catch-all for every situation, but you're going to have to go through and say, okay, what's helpful for our situation? Maybe some human factors stuff, and even their subheadings for human factors aren't as helpful for what we might need, et cetera, et cetera. However, maintainability, life cycle concerns such as maintainability, repairability, um, you know, if you're going to develop a new process, how is it going to be maintained? How can people refine it, etc. after you're gone? Anyway, things to think about. It's a good big picture thing that might help you. Um, Prioritize. So once you come up with a bunch of different metrics, so we go down to all these requirements, and you maybe find a bunch of valid requirements. Um, so step one back behind that, you've defined the problem. You've done some, say, a little bit of data collection, Pareto analysis. Now you know what your key issues are. Um, then you're starting to use the sort of terminology of requirements, um, and you write down particular requirements, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, which requirements are the most important. And once you narrow it down to maybe a subset of your original understanding of all the relevant requirements, one way to prioritize is to, with your own understanding of the system, of course, but also getting the stakeholders to weigh in. And one good way to do this is to give the customer 100 points to distribute over all the requirements and see how they weigh them. Um, ranking ranking them is okay too, but the distributing of 100 beans across the 10 priorities can help you get a better chance of, is one twice as important as another. If you get people just to simply rank them, you don't know if one is twice as important as the other. Um, benchmarking. So you folks have done this now. Important. Some folks have done this already. A key idea with benchmarking is against what else is available. So if you guys are deciding to produce a new process of some kind, um, then you have to think, okay, what's the current process? How are they meeting their needs now? If their needs are they're trying to get their customers served as quick as possible, um, that's that's kind of your current benchmark. That's how they're doing it now. And then you can benchmark your proposed new solution against what's currently being done. Okay, and so there may be a couple different ways per employee. There may be various ways they're already getting things done that need to get done. Your particular requirements. One simple requirement being, customers need to get served as soon as possible. So how is this being done? So we typically benchmark. We're thinking of, we have some product and we're trying to compare that with other products. But we have to think outside of the box here as industrial engineers in our context. How is it that people are able to reach their goals currently, and how are we going to modify that with our solutions? Okay. Then once after that, we're starting to generate actual numbers, actual requirements. Okay, so we're moving away from the hand wavy, totally subjective stuff. It has to be, some product has to be easy to attach. Well, how are we going to measure that? Okay, well, by that we mean it has to have fewer than 5 steps, or it has to attach in less than 10 seconds, or okay, so it's very important to start translating, because we've spent enough time, ideally, we've spent enough time in the problem definition stage of talking about ideas and themes and stuff like that to round out the picture with fuzzy edges, and now we're trying to really nail things down. So if you can't translate things into a measurement of time or what number of steps or whatever, then that means you probably don't understand well what the problem was. You have to go back to thinking a bit more, refining the problem, then translating it into some kind of requirement, and then attaching some kind of measurement to it. Okay, so then there's a last steps. This is all from the QFD chapter, the Allman chapter posted online. Let's see here. Last few steps here, setting a key one being step 7. What is a good value to shoot for? So I have a measurement. So is 30 seconds a good value to shoot for people to get their coffee? So how do you come up with reasonable? So if you just say, I think that 30 seconds is good because it's really fast, that I'm going to shoot you down on the 25th, Monday the 25th. That's not good enough. It has to be, well, how did you come up with 30 seconds? I don't know. It seems fast. Well, that's not good enough reason. You have to say, well, one reasonable thing to do would say, well, Tim's does it in in a minute. So then I might say, well, to be honest, if Tim does it in a minute, if you guys go anywhere close to a minute, you're probably doing well. Okay, so if Tim does it in a minute, probably a minute 30 is, in other words, I mean 90 seconds is probably the best thing to shoot for. Okay. Um, steps. So there's these other kind of steps here going on, but that's a key one. And so here's the house of quality. So I haven't really gone on about the house of quality, what is it, and yada yada yada, because I think it's kind of too much detail going on there, and I'm not sure it's limited in its usefulness for our particular applications in industrial engineering. However, I think key points are important to pull away from here. So, the customer gives a way of identifying all the requirements in blue here. What's going on? Customer preferences. This is how they've decided. They've got two different customers, and they've said, okay, this type of customer likes to weigh their preferences in this fashion. This other customer weighs them in this fashion. In some ways, these customers have been so wishy-washy, it's hard to tell what's most important. But, I guess they have at least top five. You can say, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things here take up, 80% of the 80% of their 100 beans. So those would be good ones to focus on. So don't even, so then you start caring very little about these ones weighted 6, 4, and 1 and 4. You care about the ones weighted in double digits. So in our case, it may be only 3 things you really need to focus on, whatever, right? So it's up to you to determine these things. The point is we've got requirements that are specific and measurable. We've got preferences and the metrics. We've got a way to measure our requirements. So if it's deliver coffee quickly, then quickly has to have some kind of number, and so they have these numbers and these measurements. So then you can start to compare, how does our process compare with the alternatives. Right. So if they say I want to have a wholesome VR experience, well, what does that mean? It has to be measurable. That means number of kids games available, number of complaints about sound below 5 per month or whatever, right? So you come up with something. It doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be. It can't be perfect. It just has to be reasonable, and you have to give reasons as to why did you pick 5 complaints per month as whatever customer satisfaction level, etc. Okay, so you may note that the marks were fairly high on the first report. So note, I'm going to be a little harsher, not because I want to be, but just because I think this is going to be harder, and you really kind of start to have tangible results at this point. And by tangible results, it means that you've thought hard and long enough about this that you're going to have good questions and measurements. And so I'm going to start asking questions. Well, like I said, how'd you come up with 30 seconds as a good delivery time? And if you don't have good answers, you're not going to get a good mark on this. So what you need is, I'm going to look at the rubric in a minute here, where I describe in detail what you need. So from a big picture point of view, when I pull up the rubric here, it's obvious, but the problem should be very well defined. You should have prioritized what the key problems are. I'd say probably 3 problems ish that each group should say that should focus on. We're going to focus on these 3 key problems, and here's why. We're focusing on them because they're most important, and by most important, we mean they're going to affect revenue the most, and we think they're going to affect revenue the most because we've done these studies, or because research shows this, and because we've observed this, and these are the high priorities. Then you're going to develop requirements well. You're going to state the targets, numerical targets. You're going to look at benchmarks, and so it's important. Benchmarks versus workarounds. They're both kind of like benchmarks in that category. Benchmarks are typically what other products are out there that satisfy the same need. Workarounds are, if you're developing kind of a new process or a new way of doing things, how are your customers, whether they be the employees of, say, chimneys, or the owners of chimneys, how are they fulfilling a need themselves without even really realizing it, by working around issues, and you're helping them not work around but work through. And I will highlight, last time I didn't put it on the rubric, but there should be no solutions mentioned. Okay? No solutions mentioned in your report. You can have a side log somewhere in your notebook, keeping track of important ideas because you don't want to forget them, but you should not be talking about them. And that's what this last, dang it, there was a last, I'll have to pull that up, in the updated piece. Let me see here under lectures. Sorry, I pulled up the wrong, of course, I pulled up the wrong PDF. But there is I'm also sipping my coffee, if you're wondering what that sound was. The last little bit, I uploaded another few sections of a chapter as well. And so I just summarized that briefly and violated some, information presentation rules in that there's a ton of information on this slide. However, okay, keep in mind that your requirements list will need updating, so don't be too worried about it being perfect, okay? So the big point of this whole class, this Design 3 class, is we're trying to learn the difference between typical courses you take and a real-life kind of consulting gig and your PII course. You're translating, you're bridging into the world of the really real, where there aren't perfect solutions and there aren't answers at the back of the book, and it depends on if what you're doing makes any sense. Okay, so as you develop your requirements lists, it has to make sense. It doesn't have to be perfect, so don't waste time trying to get it perfect. Okay, so from this other book that I uploaded, a few pages, move forward when it seems you've got sort of good enough. It looks like, yeah, this is tight enough. I've narrowed my problem. I've got some requirements. I've got some goals to shoot for. Okay, and then later on we're going to have to amend it and change it and update it. Okay, requirements lists. If you do it well, you structure it well, have a nice little document. It's a good thing to have around because you can use it as a template for next time, for your next project, say for PII. Practical concerns. We covered this with the other chapter, but certain requirements will often not be explicitly stated. Make sure they're on your requirements lists, and so that in your contextual inquiries will have unearthed some of these tacit needs. Again, about the solutions, do not mention solutions on your presentation day, which is the Monday right after break, which I believe is February 25th, although I'm terrible with dates, as you know. So it's not wrong to think of them or not wrong to take note of them, but do not put them in your requirements list and don't talk about them unless the client or I ask you something on that Monday. Yes, looking at failures. You folks have noticed this as well, and translate them, okay? They're not good at doing this. They're terrible at doing that, all right? That's a good thing to notice. Now try to translate that into solution neutral requirements. So, hey, their place isn't very attractive. They should make it more attractive. So, well, they should make it more attractive by painting and stuff like this. Well, that's not solution neutral, okay? So then you start to say a requirement is the ambiance should be a positive, okay? Well, that's not measurable. So that's the starting point. Okay, it should be positive. What does a good ambiance mean? What's one way of measuring that? Right? Then you can say, okay, the floors have to be cleaned once a day, or the lighting has to be at least 75 lumens. You get a light meter in there. Like I don't know. You guys run with this, right? Find some way to see if you can double check if you're achieving the goals your client that you think the client should be achieving. Okay. So be careful, and that's why I didn't go on about the house of quality too much. Systematic methods of defining requirements are basically a suggestion Okay, there's no perfect way of doing it. The way you can kind of get lost in the details, and I find like the house quality, for instance, is so complex, and you wonder what's the point of it. But you're trying to stick to the key characteristics of a good way of defining requirements. So, key ideas: differentiate between needs and desires. Make sure you don't assume what somebody says is an actual need. You have to dig into it and prove that with qualitative and quantitative data that it truly is a need. And don't think that any of your ideas are necessarily needs and wants just because you see it or you see an issue. And um, like one group picked up on, and I liked how they observed that some of the VR times were going a bit too long, and they thought this is maybe a need to make sure that people only take up exactly an hour if they pay for an hour. Be careful because that may actually not be a need. Okay, so the client may not want that, the owners may not want that, the employees may not want that, and even the clients, the users of the VR lounge may not want that. So you have to double check these things. You can't assume. So you have, and that story overlaps the idea that there are various customers. Okay, and I just labeled three: the owners, the employees, and the actual consumers of the product. In this case, the product is not a physical product; it's an experience. Particular goals for the project, and then, okay, of course, particular goals for the project and actual numbers to work toward, and looking at the competition benchmarking. So these are kind of not the four, but four key areas that requirements lists are trying to get at. Okay, so just don't lose sight of that. So lastly, this video is turning to be a lot longer than I initially expected. Lastly, I want to look at the rubric. It's this massive beast of a rubric. I'll go over it quickly here, but I'm trying to be specific. So I'm just going to talk about the right-hand panel because this is what you're trying to shoot for. So again, scope, you've unearthed some problems and you give good reasons why you focus on some problems as opposed to others. It cannot be your opinion. There's got to be qualitative and quantitative data to prove why you narrowed it down. So then I've got requirements A, B, C, D here. The project is, so this is just from the book. The requirements you do make follow these rules from the book. These characteristics. They're not hard and fast, but they are sort of themes. Secondly, requirements have been prioritized, so you can tell what are very important requirements, and then conversely, what are requirements that you've included but aren't overly necessarily important. You've translated them into numbers, and you've chosen good numbers, appropriate, justifiable numbers. The stuff you've done, the requirements you've come up with relate to what your initial work was in problem definition phase. And if they do deviate, which is fine because everything's an iterative process, you have to give me reasons for what's going on and why you shifted gears. Benchmarking, so did you benchmark well? Are you seeing how the goals, so now you understand the various customers and their goals. How are their needs being met or unmet right now? And measure that in terms of the requirements and the numerical targets you've set up. How are these things being met? And then what would be a good ideal goal? That's what you're shooting for. So what's going on now and where do you want to be? Customers, yeah, make sure you differentiate between actual and perceived needs. So students should understand there's a difference here. And a key conversation we had last week was that you may have to convince your client that something's a need that they don't think is a need. Okay? And you can't just tell them because it's obvious. You have to give them good reasons. Even though it may be obvious to everybody else in the room or management professional or another consultant, it's not obvious to your client. Finally, do not mention solutions this time. I know many of you did. I didn't ding you too hard for it last time. This time I will. I don't want to see any answers. I want to see a description of what an ideal solution will be. So it's what, not how. So what is a good solution? Not this is how we've come up with a particular good solution. Okay, so here's the content of a good solution, not here's a particular form for a particular solution or set of solutions. Okay, lastly, organization. Typically, it's good to, many of you did this, but I'd like everybody to do this, report organization. Typically, you say introduction. Here's what we did. And don't be afraid of, you can do the reveal. You don't have to save the end. Spoiler alert, here's what's going to happen. Like, you want a spoiler alert. Okay? In our everyday life, we don't do spoiler alerts. You're supposed to do spoiler alerts. They're called the 3 tell-ems. Tell them what you're going to tell them in the introduction. Tell them in detail in the body, and then tell them what you told them in the conclusion. That's how it works. So tell me, in the say 2-paragraph introduction, we zoomed in on this area. We've come up with these requirements. These are the 3 most important requirements. They're currently not being met very well. Boom. Okay? So then you get into the details in the body. Here's our scope. Here's why we narrowed on these problems. These are the priorities. We talked about some, again, this is only a suggestion, so it doesn't have to be perfectly set up with this, and it has to make sense. So I want you guys to work on your own, right, and make sure it flows well, not just kind of blindly following my bullet points here. Talked about perceived and actual needs. Then you get into the actual requirements here. Make sure you talk about their specific measurements. You talk about why you came with the measurements. Talk about how things measure up compared to what the goal is, and that the goals are reasonable, and you have research and observations and data to back up your goals. And lastly, benchmarking how our solutions being satisfied right now. Finally, the conclusion. And then all you do is restate. It's very similar to the introduction. You say, just a reminder, this is what we talked about. Here we scoped down to this area. We chose these top 3 or 4 problems, whatever you think is reasonable. And we focus on these requirements. These are the key requirements for each of these 3 problems. And here's our conclusions. Okay, so that's it. So I just wanted to go over, again, why did I do this, post this video? I wanted to go over what's important, and just something you need for requirements list, since I won't be easily available in the next 10 days, which is when many of you may get the bulk of this work done. Okay, so good luck, have a good break, and see you on that Monday, the 25th.